It is said that polite people never talk about two things, religion and politics. I'm going to talk about both right now. It's also said that all politics are local, and so I thought what better to start with than one of the most polarizing issues that our community is facing right now here in Elizabethtown. This is the way that I've heard the story told. We recently had our election last Tuesday. But before that, we had a candidates forum, and our very own Paula Knudsen-Burke was one of the moderators there. We had all the candidates were able to be there. It was a forum, so the citizenry was invited. Maybe some of you were there, I hope. Everybody was invited to come. People came. And the way that I hear this unfolded was like this. The candidates had their opportunity to kind of give some of their opening remarks, share a little bit about who they are. And then the moderators, of course, gave their very well thought out questions to the candidates. All the candidates then had their opportunity, and they delivered very, reasonable, sensible, measured responses to those prepared questions. And then came the time in the forum when the mic was open. It was time for we the people to step up and ask the questions that really matter to us. And so the first one was the question that would divide the candidate pool. I think it's fair to say up to that point, most of them kind of sounded the same. And so the person got up, and this was a question that was really important to them, maybe even affected their livelihood, their day-to-day sustenance. And so they got up and they said, "Candidates, I would like to know your position on backyard chickens." The candidates then gave their responses. And again, the way I hear the story told is that each candidate went through and gave very measured responses. A lot of words, but not really saying anything. They were talking about, you got to be somewhat careful, because, I don't know anything about agriculture, but I do know that, you could walk into somebody's yard and pick up something that might get carried back to a bigger poultry farm. And I even consulted our very own professor of poultry over here, Jeff Eisenbeis, the champion of chickens. And what do you call it? A chicken rancher? No? Chicken tender? That doesn't sound cool. All right. Well, I consulted Jeff, and Jeff didn't seem, he's got a huge flock, thousands and thousands of birds, and he didn't seem all that worked up. But he did mention something I thought that was very important. He said that he's heard that there's been a rise in salmonella infections that people get who have backyard chickens. And he said, and I quote, "It's from people kissing and canoodling their poultry." He also went on to say that canoodling a chicken is not as delicious as it might sound. I'll take his word for it. So the candidates, they all gave these very measured responses until we got to the last candidate, Mary, and she basically, if you know Mary, she's a very kind of plain-spoken woman, and she said, "I am proud to say," and maybe she didn't put it in polarizing language as this, but essentially what she said was, "I'm proud to say, in spite of all the mealy-mouthed responses that my other candidates have given, that I am unapologetically pro-backyard chicken." And there we have it. I don't know where you all land on backyard chickens, but I thought that would be a helpful story because we need a little bit of levity these days when it comes to talking about politics. Because as we know, the election was very divisive. It was one of the ugliest elections that we have seen. The ugliest election that, I'm not as old as some of you, the ugliest election that I have ever seen, that I've ever read about. And the ugliness has continued, not surprisingly, right? When you start off an election that way and we have an election, then the ugliness has continued. So what do we do as people who want to follow Jesus? What do we do as people of God? Now, we're in a different setting than Jesus' time. We're in a different setting than other Christians have been, even other Christians are today. So how do we want to act? Now, in spite of that, we do have, when we look to the Bible, we do have some guidance on how we want to act as citizenry. Paul, citizen of Rome, that was the situation in which he found himself. he had some advice. Now, this isn't exactly advice for how to be a citizen, but it was advice for how to get along together. This is advice that he gave to the Galatians, which was a community, a Christian community that was in conflict. They were trying to work out their rules in this new community. It's actually kind of a network of communities. And they were locked in arguments about how to do things and how to do them, quote unquote, the right way. Even how to approach the rules. How do we even set up rules? Should they be really legalistic kinds of rules? Should they be less restricted kinds of rules? And if they're less restricted, then how are we even going to kind of have any rules at all if we get too loose with the rules? And so I find it really interesting. This is where I feel like we can learn something. I find it really interesting the way Paul frames the debate, even for us in our civil context. Paul says this. He says, if we're all saved by Christ already, and if you and I are saved by Christ, we have tremendous freedom. And in that freedom, we have to ask the question, what am I going to do with the freedom that I have? What are you going to do with the freedom that you have? Am I going to use my freedom to try to get whatever I want? And am I going to use that freedom to try to get my way all of the time? Because, of course, my way is the right way, right? Or am I going to use my freedom in a different kind of way? And here's the way he talks about it. He says, it's obvious what kind of life develops out of trying to get your own way all of the time. This is from The Message, so using more contemporary language. Repetitive, loveless, cheap sex. A stinking accumulation of mental and emotional garbage, frenzied and joyless grabs for happiness, trinket gods, magic show religion, paranoid loneliness, cutthroat competition, all-consuming yet never satisfying wants, a brutal temper, an impotence to love or be loved, divided homes and divided lives, small-minded and lopsided pursuits, the vicious habit of depersonalizing everyone into a rival, uncontrolled and uncontrollable addictions, ugly parodies of community. I could go on. Does any of that sound familiar in our political scene? This isn't the first time I have warned you, he goes on. You know, if you use your freedom this way, you will not inherit God's kingdom. But what happens when we live God's way? God brings gifts into our lives. These are the fruits of the Spirit. They sound a little different than the way you might have learned them in Sunday school. Much the same way that fruit appears in an orchard, things like affection for others, exuberance about life, serenity. We develop a willingness to stick with things, a sense of compassion in the heart, and a conviction that a basic holiness permeates things and people. Remember, he's talking to a divided community. That means everybody, even those with whom you disagree. A conviction that basic holiness permeates all things and all people. We find ourselves involved in loyal commitments, not needing to force our way in life, able to marshal and direct our energies wisely. So when we talk about freedom, especially when we talk about freedom in the civil context, it's often the ability for me to do what I want to do. It's my freedom, it's my right. But Paul frames it a different way. Yes, you have freedom, we have freedom in Christ. Now, what are we going to do with this gift? Is it for us and us alone, me and me alone? When I use my freedom, will something good come out of it? Will there be fruits born and enjoyed? When we take a step back, I think we all know how we want to use our freedom. We want to use it for the common good, for the benefit of all. We don't want to use it in a community that is at war with itself or a nation divided. So will we succumb to those attitudes like these? Or will we build something different? If you remember this, You remember that greed becomes equity. You remember that fear becomes courage. You remember that power, remember, this is a trick one. You remember this one? Still power. We have power. How are we going to use it? Hatred becomes love. Dishonesty becomes integrity. Arrogance becomes humility. How do we reconstruct with God? One of the ways we talked about doing that was after the election. As pastors, we knew going into the election that there would be broad swaths of people in this country who were really disappointed and broad swaths who were really excited, no matter who won. And that's what we saw as pastors, starting the day after the election. And so we wrote a letter, and I asked Nate and Adrian and Anna to share with us this morning that letter, and they're going to read it. And I thought it was really powerful to think about hearing this letter in their voices, the voices of a generation on its way up and to come. This is the letter with some slight modifications to make it real for today. At the end, you will have an opportunity to read the last sentence. It will be on the screen. It's also in your bulletin if you want to read it there. So, thank you all.
Sisters and brothers of the Elizabethtown Church of the Brethren,
we lament.
We lament the toxic nature of our political climate and the divisions it has exploited and created in our nation, communities, and families.
We lament the lack of sensitivity, civility, humility, and respect present in our nation.
We lament the weaponization of our differences by gender, class, religion, race, and ethnicity.
We lament that many of the most vulnerable in our community feel scared.
Hear us, God.
We search our hearts, confessing our sin as we need to.
We confess that we have harbored hate on our hearts and vilified the other.
We confess that we have been silent when we should have spoken, and spoken when we should have remained silent.
We confess that we have been part of the politics of division by commission and omission. We have enabled negativity and vitriol, mocked our opponents, and conformed to this world rather than being transformed by the renewing of our minds. Romans 12.
We confess that we have made idols out of the candidates and the election, placing them before God.
We confess that this idolatry has skewed our sense of perspective. We remember that many in our world awoke today with empty bellies and under immediate physical threat of life, limb, and property.
Forgive us, God.
We commit.
We commit to praying for all of our leaders, 1 Timothy 2. May they serve justly, fairly, and humbly for the common good.
We commit to valuing all life. Each person is a child of God.
We commit to loving our enemy, Matthew 5.
We commit ourselves to the ministry of reconciliation, 2 Corinthians 5, which has been entrusted to us as an ambassador for Christ, even for those whom we disagree.
We commit to loving neighbor, Luke 10.
We commit to protecting and walking side by side with the least of these, Matthew 25.
We commit to Jesus' way of speaking truth to power in defense and support of those who are marginalized. Empower us, God.
Living as strangers in a strange land, Exodus 2. We affirm that we are first and foremost citizens of God's kingdom.
We recommit ourselves to the way of Jesus, unapologetically practicing peace, service, and openness to all.
Thank you for reading that for us.